Hey, everybody, welcome back to another edition of the Security Repo Podcast. We are sharing our journeys out there and sharing security with the wider world. Thank you for helping us with that mission and sharing this with your friends, liking, subscribing, and all that. And speaking of sharing journeys, I am very excited about today's guest. Darren Desmond has been an information security leader and certified information system security professional with a diverse expertise in security risk management within the UK defense sector, global online gambling industry, and major UK telecommunications and media companies. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Dwayne. It's nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you as well. So we're always interested in people's journeys on this show. Like, how did they get into security? There's a lot of people listening who are like right on that fence. They're thinking about getting in security. I've had people come up to me and say, "Look, you were the first show I listened to that actually said, 'How do you get in?'" So let's just start there. How did you get into the world of security? Why security?
I kind of fell into it really, which is a fairly common story for a lot of people who end up in roles similar to mine. But I used to run the family business, which was a fish and chip shop, many moons ago, and I kind of realised that wasn't what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So I joined the British military, the British Army in particular, as as a military police NCO, a non-commissioned officer, and during my time in that role, I started to get more and more involved in the technical aspects of investigation. So, the first time I realised you could send data down a telephone line, for example, I was sending surveillance images down from a suitcase-based computer via floppy disk to a base station. So we were performing surveillance back in the day on various different miscreants, and we'd upload the footage via dial-up telephone line. So that piqued my interest. Shortly after that, in the same role, actually, we started using a lot of covert cameras, so we call them board cameras. So fitting those and transmitting that data via microwave was one of my tasks, and I found it quite interesting. So from there, my career progressed. I ended up transferring to the special investigation branch, which is like a level 3 criminal investigation. So it's like what would it equate to in the US? I guess it would be like FBI style investigations, right? So level 3, we call it in the UK, sort of grand scheme of things. We have an organisation in the UK police environment called the Criminal Investigation Department, or CID, and the Special Investigation Branch is the military equivalent of that. So as I progressed through my career there, again, I got more and more involved in technology as we investigated more and more different criminal activities, and many of those activities involved a computer device of some sort. So I got involved in computer forensics and gained an interest in that. I transferred to military intelligence towards the end of my career. Did a couple of years of military intelligence, and we do a lot of work with US forces again, actually in Iraq in particular. And we had a document exploitation cell there. So when strike teams would go out on operations, they'd bring back lots of mobile phones, personal devices, handheld computers, all that sort of stuff. So those guys would exploit those devices, and then we act on the intelligence we glean from there. So that's really where my interest came. I did my first cybercrime investigation, even though it wasn't called that back then, in 2000, actually, in the British Embassy in Bonn. So that was quite an interesting one for me, and it's kind of grown from there.
You've had an interest in threat intel from the very beginning. Like, that literally was your intro to it.
Yeah,
That's
yeah. So it's more traditional intelligence gathering. So that to start with, and it's understanding the threat intelligence cycle and how that works in the physical environment was easily able to be transferred to the virtual world then.
so. What point in your journey, like going through security, going from security to information security, and that these you look at the role of the CISO and like, yes,
Hmm.
that's something I could aspire to.
Yeah, so I guess as I moved into the commercial world in 2009, I was focused initially on computer forensics, and then when you're running investigations, you really do need to build an intelligence picture to progress the investigation, to bottom it out, as we call it. So I kind of moved into threat intelligence roles for a couple of years, and whilst I love that aspect of security, I realised it was very niche. And doing that as a long term career was quite difficult. And there's a few larger companies like the banks and whatnot that recruit threat intel roles specifically, and some of the service providers obviously provide that as a service. And I didn't really want to do that, so I stepped into a broader information security role, working for a clinical data company in the UK. And that was my first experience of more holistic security management. And I implemented ISO 27001 there, which was very exciting times. Um, I say that tongue in cheek.
Anyone's ever described ISO as exciting?
No, it wasn't, but it was my first sort of proper exposure to more holistic information security, and it made me realise how no single control is really worth its salt on its own. You have to layer controls, and you have to have a portfolio of controls to slow down or restrict an attack's impact. So that was my first exposure there. And I moved back into a threat intel role for a short period of time with Virgin Media, which is a UK-based media company. We did lots of really interesting work there actually, but again, I wanted to move into a broader role. So then despite that, I moved into another threat intel role and another one after that before I became the head of InfoSec for the AA. So it was quite a difficult journey to get into that broader role from such a niche background, to be honest with you. So, I didn't have a great deal of experience in a broader InfoSec role, but I knew enough to sort of, get by the interview. And luckily, I had a new boss that believed in me. Recruited me, and I built the information security function at the AA more or less from scratch. Because when I arrived at the AA, there was no security function to speak of. So did a couple of years as the head of InfoSec there, building a team out. We had a very capable but very small team. The guys that came and worked for me used to, they worked flat out, as all security teams do. But these guys and girls did the work of two people every day. So each, I mean, by that. So I was very lucky, recruited well, and had some great people supporting me. As that progressed, it became apparent to me that we needed a more strategic view. And I actually spoke to my CIO who I worked for at the time, and I said, look, you probably need to hire a CISO here. Having me do the InfoSec stuff is great, and we've got a very small security operations capability. We need somebody who's more strategically placed to talk about the long term strategy of the organisation and give us some direction. And he turned around to me and said, "Well, you're the CISO, aren't you?" And I said, "Well, no, my role, my job isn't, job description isn't really that." So I was told with a flea in my ear to go away and rewrite my job spec, which I did. And shortly after that, I was promoted and made the CISO of the company. So that's kind of how it happened. As I say, I kind of fell into it a little bit, really.
It just like the rest of everybody else I meet in security, it's like, well, I was doing this thing, and
Yeah,
we need this other thing, and like, aren't you already doing that thing?
yeah, yeah.
Um, but I am curious to dig into that just a little bit. Like, what were the surprises for you as you moved into that role? Like,
Hmm.
what changed for you, basically?
Yeah, so it's engagement at the C-suite, at board level in particular. So I was already presenting to the board, non-executive directors, and the general executive committee, on a regular basis. And it was more the engagement with external partners. We have a lot of B2B partners and third-party suppliers um, that we do work with on a regular basis, monthly if not weekly in most cases. So it's the engagement there you get at different levels. It tends to be much more at an appropriate business level between senior security leaders. I think if you're working in tech or you're seen as a tech security SME, quite often the focus is all around the technology and not necessarily about the people or the processes or even the business drivers. So it can. I think it's getting better as an environment, as a landscape. But I think if you're sort of focused very much on technology, it's quite difficult to break out of that sometimes and have a broader conversation.
What has changed since you've been on the job? Like, what have you seen, or how have you seen the role of CISO evolve since you started doing it?
Well, I think it varies depending on how much money is available in the environment, right? So we're obviously going through, and certainly in the UK, we're going through some financial constraints at the moment. So I think a lot of companies are constricting their hiring around security teams again, and a lot of CISOs, or indeed the other way around, a lot of CIOs are wearing two hats now. So they're CISOs and the CIO. I'm starting to see a lot more of that now, and some of the people that I know in the environment, in the industry rather, they're wearing two hats. They're either the head of IT and the head of security, or they're the CISO and the CIO. And I think that's becoming more common. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing because obviously you've got a healthy tension there between availability of service, but also the security aspects, the confidentiality and integrity of the service as well. So I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. But for the person that fulfills that role, you do have to obviously balance the two and communicate that upwards to your own leadership team. So whilst I think it's no bad thing that happens, I think having separate roles brings a different perspective to it.
Interesting. And just from a it's 2025, I have to throw in a question about AI.
Hmm.
Has AI impacted your role? Like, how are you dealing with this whole new world of agentic AI getting deployed everywhere and needing to secure that as well?
Yeah, for sure. So it's having a big impact on what we do. We were one of the early adopters of some of the AI capabilities in our security tooling, which was great, and it gave us lots of capability, particularly against phishing emails. You know that they're getting a lot smarter. Again, probably because people are using AI to make them smarter. But the tooling we deployed helped counter that. So that was a fairly easy win for us. I think more broadly, and again from a business goals or mission or objective perspective, what we have is large user base. We've got about 8,000 people, all of whom want to use AI for various different reasons. So you've got the consumers in the organization that want a solution. And then you've got the developers and all the people on the business side wanting to, create efficiencies, cut costs, do more with less. Um, in terms of the AI agents and capabilities they're going to build. So we've got two different challenges. The first one we tackled fairly early on by blocking access to all AI for everybody, and then only allowing the use of AI where it's properly licensed. There's a legal agreement in place, or if you've got a particular use case to do some research, we'd run that through an approvals process. So we kept the attack surface, if you like, fairly small and constrained that. We also then built an internal chat GPT based on chat GPT-4 for staff to access on our domain so we can control the data that goes into it, which our staff used quite quickly. They started adopting it quite quickly. And we've also run a pilot for Copilot. We've got a number of Copilot licenses in the organization. We've just finished an enterprise evaluation. Excuse me. We've just finished an evaluation of enterprise Chat GPT. So, we've got lots of different solutions for the end user community in the organization. And we're working towards a holistic solution. So I don't know which side of the fence we'll land, whether we go with Copilot or Chat GPT, via OpenAI. But we are making sure we get the right fit for the organization. Additionally, we're making sure we've got some guardrails in place. So we have launched a DLP project to enhance our data loss prevention capability and prevent people uploading lots of sensitive data to those cloud-based platforms, which before we didn't have great capability in that space. So that's working hand in hand with the AI challenges. On the other side, where we're looking at building business apps to improve our efficiencies, that's going quite well. We're partnered with a really strong contender in the Gartner top right quadrant. They're a great. I won't name them. It's not really fair on them, but they're a great provider in this space. They're well respected. I've dedicated one of my team, one of the security consultants, to working on AI projects. That's all they work on at the moment, and they're fast becoming an AI security. Uh, I don't like to use the term expert, but I will say that they're an expert in this case. Um, and they're looking at every single project in depth that we're deploying. Now we've still got a long way to go in terms of our learning and understanding of what AI can and can't do. We've really struggled to find a good supplier for penetration testing, for example, and vulnerability scanning of AI apps. The infrastructure is fairly straightforward to do. There's not that much difference from traditional infrastructure, but the apps themselves and ensuring the guardrails are effective and all that sort of stuff. We've struggled to find a decent testing capability there in our third-party partners, but we've just found one. Thankfully, they are an existing partner, and they've come up with a really good framework for security testing those applications. So that's really how we're tackling it. Um, we are following the EU AI legislation in terms of using it as a guiding light because we expect that to come into UK legislation at some point. We're obviously not part of the EU anymore in terms of the common market, so the legislation doesn't apply directly to us. But we do anticipate, in the same way we adopted elements of GDPR for the Data Privacy Act, the Data Privacy Act in 2018. We'll do the similar thing with EU AI acts and any other legislation that may impact us. So yeah, it's impacted us, but we were lucky. We got on the front foot a little bit with it. I created an AI governance framework fairly early on. Say put some blocks in, put some policies out there, which I'm on the fence about policy documents. I think if you don't make them very consumable for your audience, they're just not going to read them really. But when they do have to refer to them, they're at least available to them, and that's kind of where we are. So we're not still in the starting blocks, but we're only just out of them, I would say.
Right on. And I do want to go back to your roots, to
Hmm.
your threat intel roots, um, and how that has influenced the way that you administer information security in those conversations.
Hmm.
Like, how much of your job is just communicating risk versus or sharing those risks and gathering those risks
Hmm.
versus the business level conversation?
I guess it's probably about 50-50, really. So, I regularly get asked to provide advice and guidance on a topic that I may not be that familiar with. So when I was working in the intelligence field, sometimes you have to close gaps, knowledge gaps, with your best estimate, based on the information available, and that's not really changed. Although I have tons of information at my fingertips, like we all do these days, and we are able to form an opinion on most issues. So evidence-based research we tend to focus very much on, and then we have to give an estimated or educated guess rather when we have information gaps. It doesn't happen that often, but certainly the initial requirement, the information requirement, all good intelligence collections start with a directive intelligence requirement from the top typically, and that's typically how I treat requests from the boss and the other stakeholders in the environment.
Interesting to hear someone in the C-suite say, my boss. That's something. Yeah. Anyway, uh,
Everybody's got a boss. Unfortunately, everybody has a chief.
all right. Well, hey, thank you very much for sharing your journey. We are going to move into the part of the show where we ask all of our guests the same questions, level set, get to know everybody on that same basic level. So we'll start with the first one on security tools. Do you have a favorite all-time security command line?
Command line. Oh, there was one called MetaGoofil years ago, and again, it's an open source information gathering tool. And I think there was a user interface version called FOCA, FOCA, and it would go out and scrape a website of all the fruit off the low hanging tree there. So if you had any PDF documents, Excels, MS Word documents that were on the website that weren't properly protected, it would scrape them all up, and you'd be able to download the whole shebang, to then analyze it and determine what you need to do with that information. So MetaGoofer was a really powerful tool for doing open source intelligence gathering on a business. Quite often, certainly those days, not so much now, you don't see it, but they leave like design documents on the server. So if you get a really good understanding of the server environment, and if there are network diagrams on there, they were fantastic because quite often they'll contain sensitive information as well, which you can then utilize. So I quite like those platforms. There was a tool as well which I used to use. I used to do a lot of open source investigations, and they've changed now. But Twitter and Facebook's APIs allowed you to pull data from the back end of the platform, so you get images with their original metadata still attached to them. So those tools were quite cool to use back in the day, and I'm a huge fan of open source intelligence gathering. So anything that fits into that space, I love.
It's interesting that we still find design documents and plans and all sorts of things that shouldn't be in repos inside of repos today.
Yeah,
So we think they're secure, but as Red Hat is proving literally in real time right now,
yeah,
maybe not. Maybe not.
yeah.
Thanks to
The,
the
the,
GitLab.
the, the favorite one for us at the moment is secrets in code. Embedded in code, and we've got a few bits of legacy code knocking around where I am now, and quite often when we're doing our security testing, we'll find secrets embedded in the code, and you just smack your forehead and you think, I thought this had stopped some years ago, but unfortunately not.
I have very strong opinions about tooling for that particular problem, but we don't need to go into that. Um, so, as someone who is leading teams, do you have a favorite go-to question that you ask when you're interviewing someone?
Yeah, so if I'm interviewing somebody for a new role, I want to find out what they do in their spare time, and whether that involves, IT of any description, and if they've ever built their own computer, because I think that tells you a lot about a person's interest in IT generally. Even though, as I said earlier, I don't think necessarily security needs to sit in an IT function. I think you need to understand the terminology really well. So if I'm interviewing somebody and they've never built their own computer, for example, or never even seen inside one, and that's a bit of a red flag for me generally, because it tells me they don't have a personal interest in the space. So that's typically the questions I'll focus on, and I don't necessarily focus on tooling questions so much, but it's what do you do in your spare time? How do you use social media? Those sort of questions indicate to me how somebody's interacting with technology.
So, best advice, worst advice is one of my favorite parts of the show.
Hmm.
Um, So I'll ask you what's the best piece of advice you've heard, and then we'll flip it on its head and ask you what's the worst thing you've ever heard anybody suggest out there. So best advice.
Yeah, the piece of advice that I keep going back to, and I can't remember for the life of me who told me. I may have read it somewhere. It might have been a person who told me, but it's praise in public and chastise in private. So certainly when I've got team members who've dropped the ball or been badly behaved in whatever measure that may be, making sure I don't reprimand them, for want of a better term, in a public space is quite important for me. I know I certainly wouldn't like it if it happened to me, so I try and treat people the way I'd like to be treated. And I give praise as often as possible. I think that's a really important thing to do. The team I run at the moment, we're very focused on fixing things forward, and we forget sometimes how far we've come in a relatively short space of time. So making sure that I praise them all appropriately is the most important part of my job, really. And as I say, the best piece of advice that I've ever picked up.
That's really good advice. What is the worst piece of security advice you've ever heard in your life?
Oh gosh. Well, I don't know if it's a piece of advice, but it's an often repeated phrase, I would say, and it's, "Well, this is the way we've always done it." And every time we run into a security challenge, so we have a backlog of security issues prioritized, by the risk it presents to the organization. Every time we run down the list and we tackle or challenge somebody who's doing something that's not necessarily that safe, but it's a process or a tool they've always used. I mean, there's a couple of network scanning tools out there that developers use, for example, just to work out where they are on the network and to try and do some discovery work, but they leave these devices on servers, and the passwords are poor and all of this. So whenever you come across that sort of stuff, it's always a bit of an eye opener as to people's security culture. Yeah, so we've always done it like that. That's the worst phrase I think I've heard, and the worst thing anybody can do in IT to not really change their culture and ideology around
That's a death knell.
it.
That we don't want to progress. We don't want to succeed. Is basically what you're saying.
Yeah.
Well, here we are at the end of the show. Thank you so much for being here. We always like to give our guests the chance to have the last say. Any other advice you want to give us? Anything else you want to tell us?
I think if somebody's looking to get into cybersecurity, focus very much on either identity access management, because identity is going to be the foundstone and the cornerstone of security for many years to come. And also look at, obviously AI is a big topic, but don't forget about the other stuff, because getting the basics right is the most important aspect of security. If you don't cover your bases, all the AI in the world won't get you out of trouble. So just make sure you understand the whole landscape and not just a proportion of it.
Thank you very much for being here and sharing your knowledge. And thanks everybody out there for sharing this episode around and liking, subscribing, and all that stuff. And again, thank you very much. Have a great day.